So today I wanted to make some pizzas, but I didn't have any tomato sauce. I figured I'd take the opportunity to try out the spaghetti sauce from the show The Bear. And rather than just following what Carm can be seen doing on screen, I'm also going to try out Mikey's version as it was written down on the index card. So the first ingredient that's listed is basil steeped in oil. So into a saucepan I'm going to throw about 150 milliliters or half a cup of olive oil. And there's a number of ways you can do this depending on your level of culinary expertise. Mikey ran a sandwich shop, and not to belittle sandwich shop owners or cooks, but Mikey doesn't seem like the kind of guy that's going to draw from anything but his own experiences and family history for this recipe. So I'll turn the heat to medium. We've got a little bit of basil in the garden, so I'll pick some of that. And when the oil starts to loosen up and form some little wisps, I'll throw it on in and let it simmer for 5 or 10 minutes until the basil lends its flavor to the oil and starts to change color a little bit. Now I'm going to use that oil in our sauce, so I'll dump about 30 mils or a couple tablespoons of that into a saucepan. And I'm pretty sure Mikey would have thrown the basil in as well, even though most of the fragrant notes from the basil would have been drawn out by the oil at this point, leaving slightly bitter, wilted basil behind. But he specifically says basil steeped in oil, and not basil oil or any indication to strain out the basil. Next, the recipe calls for 10 cloves of garlic, but that's for a batch of 2 28-ounce cans, which is way more than I ever make for any amount of pasta. So I'm just going to go with 5 cloves here, but these are fairly large cloves. I'm going to mince them up, which of course Mikey doesn't say to do, but based on my experience in the Italian-American kitchen, you just inherently mince or slice your garlic rather than throwing it in whole. I'll saute that for a few minutes until it gets fragrant, stirring constantly. And while I usually do use SMT crushed tomatoes, I didn't have any on hand, so I'm just going with a different brand that I use when I can't find SMT. So I've got a 28-ounce can here. I'll crack it open. Add that in with the garlic and oil. And of course, Mikey, being the good Italian boy he is, knows to rinse his can with some water and dump that into the pot. I'm going to season that with some salt. Stir it around to incorporate. Let the sauce come up to a simmer. Reduce the heat to low. Cover it partially. I like to use a wooden spoon to prop it up. And let that go for at least a half an hour, if not more. While that's going, we'll work on Carm's version. So once again, I'll throw 150 mils of olive oil into a saucepan. I'll break out some garlic. These cloves are smaller, so I'm going to use 7 rather than 5. And Carm, being professionally trained, I assume that he's going to take more inspiration from mainland Italian technique, which means rather than mincing or slicing, he's going to peel the garlic, of course in the most labor-intensive chefy way, and throw them into the oil whole. Now, the reason why Italians tend to use whole cloves of garlic rather than minced ones is the garlic they use is a lot stronger than what we use in the States, so you're going to get a lot more flavor without even cutting it up. Next, I'll add in the basil, as well as a pinch of crushed red pepper. Give that a good stir so everything is coated in oil. And I'm going to leave this over low heat for about 20 or 30 minutes. Could go longer, could go for an hour if you want. But the idea here is to confit the garlic. By going slow and low, you extract a lot more flavor from the basil and the garlic. And it's a chefy way of doing things, so I assume that's what Carm is going for here. When that's all done, I'm going to strain out the contents of that oil, because again, the oil is what he's after here. It's got all the flavor, and the other things don't. But the benefit of this also is that the garlic that's left over is beautifully soft, it's lost all its sharpness, and works great to spread on bread. So as an example, I'm just going to slice off a piece of sourdough, plop a few cloves of garlic on there, mash them up with my fork, season with a little bit of salt, drizzle on some extra virgin olive oil, and this is such a nice little appetizer snack. The garlic almost has the same quality as roasted garlic, so if you ever had that at an Italian restaurant before your meal, then that's what you're looking at here. Alright, now for the sauce, I'm going to add in that basil oil. And I did add way too much here. I probably should have added just a couple tablespoons like before, but instead I added the whole bowl. He also added in about 70 grams of butter, which is an interesting thing. Maybe it's more Northern Italian inspired, but it should lend some creaminess and richness to the sauce. Next, I'll halve and peel an onion. Making sure to remove any of the roots. And inexplicably, I'm going to throw those halves into the pan. Apparently, Marcella Hazan does this in one of her sauces and has some explanation for it. Cooking them down over time releases flavor in a different way. Maybe that's true and would work really well in a ragu or some Sunday sauce that takes hours on end. But for a quick tomato sauce, this seems a bit unnecessary or just counterproductive. But I'm just doing what they showed on the show, so it is what it is. Another thing Carm did on the show was to season his oil, which is a bit weird to me. Not that it makes any difference, I've just never seen anyone do that before. Usually you season the tomatoes, that way you can taste it and get a sense of how much salt you're adding. You're not going to taste the oil to see how salty it is. Maybe you are. That's up to you. And you know, after scouring my cabinets, I ended up finding one last can of SMT tomatoes. These ones are the passata rather than crushed tomatoes, but being that he's a chef and knowing mainland Italian cuisine, he'd probably go for these if he had the choice rather than crushed tomatoes. Again, it's 28 ounces. I'll crack that open and for some reason open the lid with a spoon. I'll dump that in and, Let me just fish that out. What the heck? I'll just, so I'll put that to the side. And I'm sure that Carm also knows to rinse out your can and dump that in. Of course, he probably knows that the reason behind that is you're going to be cooking the sauce for a while. You don't want it to reduce too much into a thick paste, so you add a little bit of water. Once it comes up to a simmer, I will reduce it to low, cover it up, and let that go for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. Alright, now for the spaghetti, I'm going to use the frying pan technique, which is throw a couple servings of spaghetti into a frying pan, add about 2 cups or 500 mils of water, season with some salt, and bring it up to a boil. Basically, the idea here is that more surface area means more boiling, less water means faster boiling, and I found that that 500 mil mark is just enough water so that when it's done boiling and you have basically no water left, the pasta is done. It's really, really simple. It takes a lot less time than using a huge pot of water, and you don't have to watch it as much and wait for the water to boil before you put the pasta in. It just works, and it comes out al dente, it comes out perfectly. There's really no good reason not to do this. Another benefit is once the water has mostly evaporated, you're left with a really nice starchy coating on the pasta that the sauce will just adhere to. And since this is 2 servings, I'm going to remove half of it. I'll go in with Mikey's sauce first. About a cup of that, 250 mils. Stir it around over medium heat until it thickens up a little bit and sticks to the pasta. Then we can go ahead and slop that into a bowl. Nothing fancy or pretentious, just throw it on in. And here's what Carm sauce looks like after an hour. You can see that the onion has softened a bit, but definitely not as much as it would have done if it was minced up or sliced up. It's still large pieces of semi-raw onion that are now kind of wasted because you're not going to eat them. Or are you? Anyway, I'll throw the second half of pasta back into the pan. Add in a ladle of Carm sauce. Same deal, stir it around, let it thicken up a little bit. And of course I gotta plate this in a fancy twirl. I'm using a barbecue fork because I don't have a fancy pasta fork, but hey, it does the job. Check this out. Super easy and fairly impressive. So what do they end up tasting like? Well, Mikey's is a bit like Mikey. It's pretty intense. It's got a ton of garlic flavor, bordering on too much garlic flavor. Since we cook the basil at a higher temperature, it brings a little bit of a roasty note to this, but we also get a lot of roundness and sweetness from that basil as well. All in all, it tastes pretty different from a lot of the sauces that I've had in the past. You can sort of tell that TV writers came up with this rather than actual chefs, or maybe this is how Matty Matheson makes his sauce at home. But it's definitely an Italian-American sauce. It has that sort of checker tablecloth kind of vibe. As for Carm's, it's a little bit like Carm. It's much more delicate, it's much more nuanced, tastes a bit fancier, cleaner, much more tomato forward. Definitely reminds me of an Italian tomato sauce, but with subtle background notes of butter and garlic and basil and onion that are barely detectable. So which one of these do you think you would prefer? Let me know in the comments.